Hi everyone, I'm going to do some videos because I'm a bit sick to come into work. So I've taken my cold and flu tablets and I'm going to do some analysis with you of short answer sections that we started doing in class the other day. So on Google Classroom, I've asked you to look I put a link there to look at the 2019 Advanced English Paper 1 and to look at section 1 of that, which is the unseen text. Section 1, sometimes they call this the reading section because you've got to do a lot of reading before you can do any writing, but it's just called Section 1, and Section 1 is where you write in Section 2. Section 2 is the essay on For Us, Past the Shallows. So if you haven't had a look at that, don't watch this video, the rest of it, until you've had a look at that. I want you to have a look at and read all the 5 texts in that, and to read the questions that you're expected to answer as well. And I'm going to do this video about text 1, which is a poem called Boomerangs in a Thunderstorm for Uncle Steve, and I'll talk about how to answer that. So go and do that first if you haven't done that. Okay, now assuming that you've had a look through that paper and you've had a look at this poem, well, the first thing you might notice is that it doesn't really look like we normally expect a poem to look, because it's just set out, or mostly it's just set out as like a paragraph of writing, like an extract from a novel or a story, and then it's got these 3, almost like a haiku, but not exactly a haiku, 3 lines which are italicized at the bottom, which look somewhat more like poetry. Okay. Now, this is a 3-mark question, so, and you can see how many lines they've given you. That's an indication of how much you need to write to get the answer, to get the full marks, I mean. So the first thing to say is, even though I'm going to talk about a few different things that we can look at in the poem, you wouldn't need to mention all of those things to get the 3 marks, okay? This is sort of quality over quantity in doing an answer to a question like this. Okay, so I'll read it out first. Boomerangs in a thunderstorm, and then there's a dedication for Uncle Steve. And it would seem that this Uncle Steve is the same uncle, one assumes, that is mentioned. Okay, and the writer is called Samuel Wagon Watson. The clouds are so low that I imagine a puffy hand reaching out and sending a boomerang off course. But here we are, like it should be, an uncle and his nephew throwing boomerangs, tuning the wind, thunder cracking, hooping, or perhaps whooping shapes dance across the overcast sky. My lungs are full of the spirits of rain, and it is not long before we are both soaked, riding the storm. Our boomerangs scale the breeze. You should always throw a returning boomerang into the wind, like a sail. On the summit of the sacred Owl Mountain, Cootha dreaming, throwing boomerangs in a thunderstorm. The unsettled leaf spirals to a soaked ground, rain-disguised tears. Okay, those last 3 lines, it's important to sort of recognise them as part of the whole thing. When you look at that, you sort of think it's like something else almost, but you know, that's part of the whole thing. So they're calling this a poem, and it doesn't look like one, but I think what I would say about that is, like, it's very hard to actually give a definition of what a poem is because they don't all rhyme. They don't have a common subject matter. They don't have a common length. They don't have a common structure. And with the T.S. Eliot that we've been looking at, you can see how that is quite different to some experiences of poetry we have. And I've talked about that a bit in class, so I won't sort of go over that again. Now, one thing that, and I don't know where I heard this from or where I picked it up from, is one sort of general but perhaps acceptable definition of what a poem is and how a poem is different to other types of writing is that what a poem tries to do is it really tries to condense the power or the force of language. And so whereas a novel has hundreds and hundreds of pages to get across whatever ideas or themes that it wants to, a poem tries to condense language powerfully. And perhaps that's what's going on here, because when you read this, you can see that it has been written in such a way to really get the full force of language, and it is full of what we call techniques. which I'll go through in a minute. So on that basis, that's kind of how we can consider it to be a poem, if you like, if that helps. Because there may not be any other sort of, good definition of what makes this a poem, and they're calling it a poem, so, we have to go with that. Okay, so, when I read this the first time, and I haven't read this before 10 minutes ago, just before I was started the video, it's got these things in it that we associate with poetry, though, right? The use of language. So you've got personification. You've got personification more than once. Okay, you've got the puffy hand. Personification is where we sort of give a human quality to something which, like a cloud, isn't human. You've got the hooping. I don't know if we pronounce that whooping or hooping. Okay, the main reason we use this word is like whooping cough, and we say hooping like with an H sound, but I think whooping is also a pronunciation. And this isn't about whooping cough, this is about whooping sounds. Loud, sort of excited shouts is whooping, like celebrating almost. Whooping shapes dance across the overcast sky, so there's more personification there. Even the boomerangs scaling the breeze. I mean, scaling is what people do when they climb mountains. So it's full of this personification. And this is sort of important because the thing which is happening in this poem is, it is about the inseparability of the natural environment, the physical world and nature. It's the inseparability of that with the human spirit or the human soul or something like that. Okay, and we know that this is obviously a very it is an indigenous perspective, you could say, and so we know that one of the ideas with that is, the inseparability of people from the land. So that's very pronounced. That's very pronounced here, and that perhaps explains the personification. It means that the barrier between what is the environment and what is the person or the people is dissolved and diminished. Okay, so you've got that personification there. Tuning the wind. Okay, thunder cracking. Okay, that's a deliberately short sentence. It's like not a grammatical sentence. Thunder cracking isn't like a grammatical sentence, but it's all about the sound, right? It's short because it's to emphasize the sound of the crack. Okay, and we've got a word for this, onomatopoeia. It's one of those words we teach you in Year 7 when we do like, the basic, poetry techniques and all of that, simile, metaphor, personification, onomatopoeia, rhyme, rhythm, etc. So there's a lot of sound in this. You've got the thunder cracking, you've got the whooping shapes dancing across the sky, and you sort of, it builds up the sort of sensory, there's a lot of sensory stuff in this poem. You've got the images, and you've got the sounds, and you've sort of also got the smells as well. Almost like, where is it? My lungs are full of the spirits of rain. And you'd normally expect maybe the line to be about the smell of the rain or the physical experience of taking a deep breath in a thunderstorm. But once again, that is conflated with this idea of the spirits, okay? The spirits of, I don't know, the spirits of the ancestors, the spirits of the natural world. There's that sort of animism in the poem. Animism is like religious or spiritual beliefs which involve the idea that things in the physical environment have a soul or have a spirit. And in all different places of the world, in the past, there's been, that sort of nature worship, or at least the sort of belief that there are spirits in nature beyond what we can see. Okay, you've got the obvious closeness, the kinship closeness between the nephew and the uncle. And that's sort of emphasised with the four words, like it should be. But here we are, like it should be, an uncle and his nephew throwing boomerangs. And you could easily leave out those words like it should be, but they're deliberately inserted to sort of, indicate the spiritual rectitude, almost the necessity, the beauty, the importance of this relationship. And you've got sort of this, I say kinship, because there's this sense that the uncle is teaching the nephew, right, about something, about boomerang throwing, about communicating with nature and its spirits, about the proper relationship with the land, etc., etc. Down towards the bottom, on the summit of the sacred owl mountain, well, that also goes to the idea of the long-standing traditional stories and understandings of things which go beyond describing them just physically. What is the sacred owl? Well, I don't know, you don't need to know, but it's got some spiritual importance beyond just being a mountain. Cootha dreaming. If you've been to Brisbane, or if you know about Brisbane, this is Mount Cootha. Okay, it's called that. That's its name that appears on maps and everything. Mount Cootha. It's obviously an Aboriginal word. And incidentally, in the source material at the bottom, right at the bottom, Watson, Samuel Wagon, Love Poems and Death Threats, St Lucia, UQP 2014. UQP is University of Queensland Press, and St Lucia is the suburb in Brisbane where that university is. It's a really beautiful place, and if anyone has the idea of getting away from the cold and the damp of the Blue Mountains and going to study somewhere else one day, you could do a lot worse than University of Queensland. It's really, really nice. So this is a Brisbane, amongst other things, this is a Brisbane sort of poem as well, and it would have more resonance perhaps if you knew this place and had been there. And it sort of takes on a little bit more meaning for me because you can drive to the top of Mount Cootha, and then Mount Cootha overlooks the Brisbane area, and you can look down at the city from the top of Mount Cootha, and it's really, really pretty. It's really beautiful, and you can understand how it would be a very important place to people and to a culture, absolutely. Okay, and then you've got this sort of like a haiku. Let's do the syllables. The unsettled leaf spirals to a soaked ground. Well, that's only 6. Rain disguised tears. Well, that's only 4. So I don't think it's deliberately a haiku, but it's sort of, which is normally 5, 7, 5 syllables. But it's very much like a haiku, because the important thing with haikus, apart from the syllables, is that haikus are meant to present an image, and it's only got the space to present one strong image, which creates emotions. Okay, it's an image which can lead to other thoughts and feelings. It goes beyond just the image itself. Okay, so the unsettled leaf spirals to the soaked ground. Now, I think the unsettled leaf is the boomerang, because it's spiraling towards the soaked ground, and if you throw a boomerang, it's going to fall to the ground. It's raining, so the ground is soaked. So now the boomerang is described as a leaf. Rain disguised tears. Well, that's a bit of a mysterious line to me, because is anyone crying? Maybe it's such an emotional experience that the tears are the tears of the narrator, or of the uncle, possibly. And well, if you're crying in a thunderstorm, your tears are disguised, right? But are the tears able to be interpreted in some other way? I think it's perfectly fine to assume that it's such an emotionally intense experience that there is crying going on. Okay, so I think we've said enough about that we could write an answer to it. Explain how boomerangs in a thunderstorm represents an intense moment. That's the question. Well, so I'd like you to have a go at writing an answer to that in the space which is allocated to you. And there's lots to talk about there. But if it was me, I would focus my answer around the idea, the intensity comes from the inseparability of the human and the natural, and the connection between people and environment, which is so strong that that you can't sort of talk about the two things separately. Okay, then you could look at some of the particularly vivid descriptions, possibly including the onomatopoeia and or personification. And I would probably want to say something about those 3 lines italicized at the bottom, which I call the haiku-like lines. Okay, so can you try writing an answer to that? And I'll do another video shortly looking at text 2. Thanks.